the link open on their own screen? Oh, do you all have the link open for yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can do action items.
You are wonderful. Who will do notes? I'm gonna set up a queue next time and start assigning people, but I didn't do that yet. I nominate. Who's on my list? I nominate Kramer TJ.
All right, I'll take notes. Sounds great.
Okay. There are no action items. I went through them already. Yay team, except maybe Felix, but I think you did leave some comments on the Tri-Trait version 2 RFC, didn't you?
Yes. I just haven't finished, although it's basic. I think I'm basically done at this point.
I'm gonna check you off. You get credit. So DREF patterns. The team last time we requested that people should update the charter to scope it to standard library types. They did so. I feel pretty okay about pursuing this now. Is it Scott as liaison? Is that still okay with you, Scott, or you think you have time to kind of just watch along?
Sure.
That was enthusiastic. Okay. You can say no.
No, I'd like to see this. It'd be a good thing to have. So we'll see what happens.
All right. Then there's an action item here, which is FCP merge. I'll do it since I've been commenting until now. All right. Add const UB RFC number 3016.
Sorry, quick point of order. As note taker, am I also responsible for editing items?
Sorry, I'm just so accustomed. I will not type unless necessary. You don't have to add them to the action item list. That's Mark's job.
Okay.
But you have to add them to this doc.
Wonderful, thank you.
Because we believe in whatever the opposite of dry is. Redundancy. So, okay. What do we have here? Add const UB RFC. So last time this was on the list, but I skipped it because I didn't know why. And Ali left a comment. Seems like the answer is it's at a steady state. And there's some implementation work that has been done. I feel like we should FCP merge this. But maybe I don't know. Has anyone even read it? I have to admit, I'm not sure if I have. I can't remember anymore.
I think I did a while ago, and I like the new version now that it's, hey, we can actually check stuff. That makes me happy.
I wouldn't be opposed to either everyone takes an action item to read it who hasn't read it already, or we FCP merge it and you still have to read it who hasn't read it already.
Yeah, I'm fine with FCP merging with the idea that I will go and read it.
I think that's good.
For the purposes of the minutes, who needs an action item recorded to read it? I do.
I'll take one.
It's very helpful to me if they're on that list. Okay. Excellent. So, update on RFC 3067. This was nominated. Last time we said that we wanted there to be some solution to the case of kind of recursive macros. There's been some discussion. I don't think there's a totally clear sorry, I don't think there's a totally clear answer yet. I didn't actually read the updates that Ryan posted. But one thing that also came up on Zulip that I just saw was that there are some other problems, like if you have a macro that recursively uses itself, even if it doesn't rely on shadowing, and you use that macro from another crate, then lacking hygienic paths means that the macro can't invoke itself. Does that make sense? Like, forgive me, Mr. Note Taker, but I figure this makes sense.
Nico, should I try and explain?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, hi, Ryan. I didn't realize you were here. Yes, go ahead. But I'll just post the example here while you talk.
Okay. So we tried to differentiate between recursive versus private macros. Recursive macros being ones that call themselves, and if you have a macro that calls itself, if its top level invocation is happening through some scoped path, like let's say it's defined in module M inside of another module N, if you try to invoke that macro, it will try and call itself just with no path attached to it. So inside of itself, it would just call, my macro or whatever. And then when it gets expanded just to my macro and not to the fully qualified path to where it lives. And so we don't know which macro you're actually calling. And so the one possible solution to that would be to introduce a new kind of macro specific keyword similar to $crate, like $self, which would refer to the module where the macro is being defined in. But that also has several problems. Like if the macro is re-exported, then it's still not available through its fully qualified path. It's available through some other path. So there's a whole bunch of problems there.
I have to say this makes me somewhat like, I don't know, like less keen on doing this. Maybe Nick Cameron was right in his comment that why bother? Let's just make macro work. It's not that this particular thing is not bad. It's just that we keep coming up with new little things, and I'm worried.
Well, I guess it seems like we had an alternative strategy to trying to mitigate them directly, to just say, yeah, we're going to migrate all macros to have an attribute on them that says it's a legacy macro. And then, new macros get written and they get into, and they avoid all of these problems because they just don't encounter them from the first place.
Well, there is one concern there, though. Even if we do that, we need to specify what do we expect people to do as a replacement for repeatedly define the same macro and use it. And if we have an expected replacement, that's fine, but the expected replacement can't be tag your brand new macro as a legacy macro.
Yeah, exactly. There's no clear path forward to how you would actually make this work in the new system, and that's not even the only one. There's also the fact that that macros can't shadow, and so if you define a macro multiple times within another macro, previously that's fine. It would just shadow the previous definition, but now you get a namespace clash, and there's really no way to avoid that.
I guess I am not sure I'm convinced that it would be necessarily bad for us to be in a place where we just say, some macro patterns require, maybe I wouldn't call it legacy, but some macro patterns require this old form, and that's fine.
Shadowing feels pretty obscure to me. I could live with that. I feel like there's got to be some ways to manage it. It never even occurred to me as something to do in the first place. Recursion is like, I don't know. If it's not trivial, it's recursive, because that's the only way you parse in a macro, as far as I can tell. So I feel like we want at least a solution to that. $self might be a tolerable one.
Didn't we already say that $self is a breaking change that we couldn't do because we wanted to make that
like
be a path?
We did, yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah, we separately discussed
Yes.
that we would want to introduce paths there as the feature, and then I think we decided that we weren't going to do that.
Yeah,
In favor of
that's
macros
right.
2.0.
Yeah, exactly. I remember this. I remember a previous use of $self. That was something I was wondering. What other feels like something that's spoken for. If $self, ignoring that problem, Ryan, did you consider that maybe it expands not to where the macro was defined, but to the path that was used to name the macro? Because that seems like the right thing.
Yeah, that's the other alternative. I just haven't fully thought through it to know whether that's possible at all times. But it seems like the right thing to do if it's possible.
It might.
So can you clarify what that alternative is?
The alternative would be that $self, or whatever we call this thing, would expand basically to the path that the top level macro was called through. So if the top level macro is called through module1 : module2 : my macro, then $self would expand to module1 : module2.
So effectively, call myself whatever myself happened to be called.
Yeah, kind of
Yes.
$0 in Bash, right? Like,
Yeah.
here's where it should be a path that can reach the macro, assuming you haven't introduced other. That's one problem with it. You'll probably want like super : $self if you're in a submodule or something that you've created.
Well,
Yeah.
one notable thing here, we don't necessarily have to define this in a way that it is expressible in Surface syntax, because a macro could output something that parses as Rust, but it's directly interacting with the parser, which is to say we could have a token that expands to call myself, and I don't care what path I am, call me. You know what me is because you're expanding me right now.
That sounds like we're asking for hygiene.
I have a question. How much of the design work we're doing right now or would be doing in the future is going to be applicable to the, what Nick wants in terms of a new macro style thing versus like, no, this is just for macro rules and has no purpose in the new world and thus is, from my perspective, potentially wasted effort?
I think it's just for macro rules.
I'm not sure about that. That particular concept of like, I want a clean way to call myself seems like something we would add to macro as well.
Yeah, but that just falls out naturally from the definition of macro being hygienic, right?
Yeah. Like
What
if we had
definition of macro?
if we had path hygiene as has been proposed, then when you write foo, you're resolving it relative to the macro definition, not the macro use. So you can naturally call yourself very easily. And it doesn't matter. It's not something you could necessarily type, like it bypasses the privacy system, which is another interesting facet of hygiene. There's kind of two ways to do privacy then, but that's why I would agree with Taylor that this is wasted effort. I don't know. On the one hand, I really like. I've already kind of in my head decided we have this feature, and I've been wanting to use it like in the standard library to put random little macros in places, submodules and things like that. And we can do it, I guess, in the standard library with pub macro. But on the other hand, I'm kind of like, this is a lot of work that no one's asking for, sort of. But
I mean, I want this feature, and I feel like it feels more tractable to me than macros 2.0, which feels like,
yes,
I don't know, it's on the verge of vaporware in my head, but maybe that's just because I'm not as tied into that.
I think that is my also feeling. Macros 2.0, we've been talking about it forever, and then nobody's actively moving on it. That could change, I guess, but.
Yeah, I guess my perspective is that it doesn't seem like if we change this from being change visibility scoping rules for all macro rules, macros, to maybe we allow some opt-in or whatever, and the expectation is that a lot of patterns that exist today will continue to exist. Like they don't have to add legacy potentially, but there's also the ability to define a macro, in some submodule, and that just works for the sort of simple macros that don't need any sort of self-recursion or anything like that.
Yeah, so one argument is to go with Petroshenkov's original proposal, right? And make it like the legacy form is no public. So all code keeps working, but then you can write public. There's a better version of macro export, essentially.
And you can do pub self if you really want the that behavior.
Right. I wasn't too keen on it when we started, but I'm mildly more keen now.
Same
I guess
here.
I would not also be opposed to making it just an attribute also, if we wanted to mitigate the like pub self is not removal of pub aspect.
Sorry,
Yeah.
so to clarify, in that world, if you wanted to write something that's recursive, you just have to not opt into the new world?
Well, you have to know a path that you can use. Right. So if you make it pub and you re-export it, you have to know the path. You can still use $crate and all that. You just have to know the path to yourself.
Okay.
I would say I don't mind the attribute, but I'm not crazy about it as like a permanent, I don't know, solution. It feels weird to me. But the other thing I would say is if we don't solve $self now, we can solve it later.
In general, I like the idea of adding pub as a means of opting into this new macro visibility so that you don't have to use macro export and you get a cleaner way of exporting macros with a scope. And at the same time, not changing the current behavior of macro rules so that we can, at our leisure and not rushing to meet any deadline requirements, design either replacements for existing things you can do with macro rules like recursion or redefinition or shadowing or local private macros or similar, or decide that rather than do any of those things, we'll go ahead and invent macros 2.0. Either way, we can make that decision at our leisure while still giving people in the common case a convenient way to export macros and have them behave just like items.
So
previously we talked about that as a migration mechanism of this way we don't break anyone and require any kind of transition, but I think it may be more practical as a here's how we let you keep doing everything you could do before without us having to define a replacement for everything.
I think I just wanted to write out something, which is why I started jotting down here. There's like 3 ways, right? There's kind of 3 ways one typically uses macros. There's kind of either a macro export across crates. There's, I'm going to call it crate local, but that's where I forget, what is it, macro use a module, essentially. And then there's sort of module local, right? And I think we reasonably cleanly solved this problem with the pub opt-in. I think
Right.
this problem is like sort of solved. It's a little awkward because you have to know the way to name yourself, but you can do it. You have to make the whole path, like have to name yourself via crate local absolute, crate path or whatever, right? Essentially the same way you would if you were macro exporting. And this one we're saying not so bad today. That's kind of the argument, right? The only thing that would be a problem is you can't define macro after its use.
Can you clarify the top bullet? Solve the problem is solved with pub opt-in.
I just mean that if we just do the Petroshenkov's original proposal, which I'm calling pub opt-in, meaning that the new behavior is opt-in via the pub keyword, it doesn't seem to me such a problem to you have to name yourself via an absolute path that is publicly nameable, but that path is kind of guaranteed to exist because otherwise they couldn't invoke you, right?
Yeah, but you might not know what that path is from the macro definition, right?
Why not?
For example, if your macro is like re-exported through something.
Well, you can. Doesn't $crate solve that? Not. Maybe that's a problem. Maybe I didn't think it through enough. Yeah, if re-exporting starts to cause problems.
But if this is cross crate, so there has to be some way from $crate to refer to you.
Right, but I think it could be different between different crates, potentially. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's the problem, I guess. I think the problem Taylor's raising is something like crate A says like, I put my pub macro rules and we should probably move on at some point, but this is kind of productive. But the point is I name it in like $crate foo or something, and then crate B tries to pub use crate A foo M, and crate C invokes it, and now it's not going to work, probably. I don't know. Don't quite know what's going to happen. I'm actually not exactly sure what happens with macro
Yeah, I'm
re-exporting
not
is
sure
kind of
whether or not
funky
this will
already.
work. Like, I could imagine this working, but I could also imagine
Right.
this not working.
Yeah. I mean, I'm definitely not super keen on a system where it's like, they work just like regular items, as long as you don't do a lot of the things you can do with regular items, at which point they start to work in odd ways, in which case I kind of rather just keep our own wacky system we have now.
Like, this might totally work. I'm just like, I don't know.
Yeah, I also don't know.
I guess as one potential sort of smaller step we could do, and I don't think Stud does this today, but we could say that, we want some solution that allows non-crate global macro export. And in order to facilitate that, like, we're okay with, Stud having macros that are local, and potentially those work because of Stud magic and unstable features or whatever. But, we don't actually stabilize anything here.
But we already do in Stud export macros using the macro keyword that way.
Do we? Okay. If we do, then that seems sort of
Yeah.
awkward, but okay.
I'm pretty sure we do. It made me like mildly nervous, but because it was like, is there some surprise lurking for us? But I think we do. So we can already do that in Stud, is what I'm saying.
Pointer raw is exported that way, right?
Yeah, that sounds right. I guess I think we should move on, but someone, probably Ryan, since you're here, Ryan, should summarize some of these questions.
Yep.
Do we need to make a list of the questions? Or do you think you can extract it from what's here in the doc? At least this re-exporting one, I think.
Yeah, I think that's probably the only one, right? Everything else is a little bit bigger is more of a decision than a question.
I think that's right. Okay, let's move on. Yeah. So Repr C is unsound on MSVC targets 81966. Josh posted a comment last time we discussed this. We wanted Repr C to match the C compiler. I skimmed the follow-up comments. They seemed like extensions, but not contradictions. Like, it would be useful to have a warning about zero-size types because they're outside of the C standard. And there might be some uses for Repr stable, but I think our job is done here. Am I mistaken?
For the most part, there has been some ongoing discussion on both the issues and Zulip to follow up, and there is one specific point that I think the Lang team would need to chime in on. Concretely, even if we say that zero-size types in Repr C should be laid out like the native C compiler, such that it might not be zero-sized effect on the layout, there is still the case of the specific zero-size types of phantom data and phantom pinned, which people use those expecting that they truly don't affect the layout at all. And it is perfectly reasonable to use those in a Repr C structure that you are also attempting to express, for example, lifetime issues with. Given that, we might, if we're going to treat constructed zero-sized types like an empty enum, for example, as or one-item enum rather, as a thing that potentially doesn't take up any space but takes up space due to alignment, then we need to look at phantom data and make sure that it still doesn't take up any space, even if that requires us to tag it somehow.
Go on. Sorry, Taylor, go.
To clarify, so phantom data and phantom pinned are not themselves Repr C, right? So we should only be talking about the behavior of Repr C zero-size types, right?
That's what I was going to say.
Like,
that is an interesting
point. What happens when you put a non-Repr C zero-size type in a Repr C structure, right? And I think the case there is that it should, at least my opinion would be that it should still be zero size. It should have no effect on layout. But if you have
Yes.
a zero member repr C struct in
Yes.
a repr C type, then it should potentially affect layout as per the appropriate, guess at what a C compiler on the platform does.
That sounds like a perfect distinction.
I was going
There's
to
also
suggest
the-
that too. I was just going to say one other thing. I could imagine a repr phantom also, but I'm definitely uncomfortable with making these structs by name special to the layout. I'd much rather.
Oh,
it basic.
agreed. No, if we were going to do that, it would be some kind of tag on those types that similar to repr phantom. But no, I think Taylor's point is substantially better. The idea that repr C zero-sized types behave like zero-sized things do in C, but that doesn't mean that things that are zero-sized in Rust and therefore allowed should change behavior. For that matter, I think the behavior change we're looking at is only with respect to alignment primarily.
Yeah,
Which,
sorry.
and these things
I
also
realize-
don't have alignments.
Yeah, I realize that that's actually a distinction I wasn't making. It's not that they shouldn't affect layout. It's that non-repr C size types in repr C structures should only affect alignment, right? Like if you declare a non-repr C struct with no members with a minimum alignment in Rust, that should just increase the minimum alignment of the repr C type that it's present in, right?
I'm confused. I thought you were saying it. You're saying it should, or if you
I'm
have
saying
okay,
if
if
you
you have a
have,
repr Rust type like phantom
Yeah.
data, and you embed it in a repr C type, you're saying it should increase the alignment.
no, I'm saying if you had a struct foo with no members that's repr Rust and you have an align annotation on it, that says like align 16, and then you put that in a repr C type, I would expect it to increase the alignment.
I see. Yes, I would expect that too, but it's not
But
orthogonal.
not affect the
That's
layout.
somewhat-
Wouldn't also affect the layout depending on what's before it? Am I missing something there?
No, because I don't think, well, I guess that's a question about whether we guarantee the ordering of repr Rust fields in repr C structs, right? Like maybe
I was expecting padding, I guess. Anyway, I mean, this is maybe in the
we're
weeds.
not doing this.
Well, I
altogether.
think the only time you can have a repr Rust field in a repr C struct is if it's zero size, right?
I think you can do it. It's just not necessarily compatible with C in any particular way.
Okay.
Yeah, I would just say we don't give layout guarantees in that case, maybe.
I think I'm trying to think why we do it. I think some people may use it to get in order layout, which is unfortunate, but possibly true.
There were a bunch of
that
comments
discussion-
about that, certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that discussion came up on Zulip as well, and I think that just because people are using repr C to mean repr in order, but I don't actually care about the layout, doesn't necessarily mean that was the intended purpose. And we might in the future want to add a repr in order or repr stable or something that will give people what they're looking for there. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that repr C is that and that we can't change it to match C.
Yeah.
I think we can change it, but I think we can't there's limits to how much we can do.
We can't
not-
break pervasive unsafe code, which would
Yeah.
be very easy to do.
I think it might right. I think people might I have to look. We took some notes on this in the unsafe code guidelines, but
It does sound like we should just have a repr only cares about size and align and does the thing that you expected.
But nonetheless, I think I agree with. I guess I don't know exactly what behavior, and I don't have too strong an opinion as of yet. But I agree with the general gist of repr Rust zero size types could behave differently than repr C zero size types.
Does everyone
Seems
agree with
reasonable.
the two bullets I wrote here? that in particular, the two things that non-repr C, or I guess I'll call it repr Rust since that's what for clarity.
Yeah, I prefer repr Rust, even if I agree with that statement.
Is it one ZSTs?
Yes. Hmm.
Using the same definition from repr transparent?
I think it's de facto one ZSTs, right?
Yeah.
Like even if we,
I'm just
It-
looking at
it wouldn't-
alignment. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, even if you, this statement and one ZSTs are equivalent because a one alignment wouldn't affect anything.
I don't know what alignment annotated specifically means because, like,
You haven't
a
added.
ZST that's a zero length array of I64 isn't exactly alignment annotated.
I would expect that I don't actually know what we do there. So I would
Yeah.
guess in repr Rust that we would not guarantee the alignment of a zero-sized array of alignment.
It
higher
does
alignment.
do that today.
Is that, sorry, when you say it does do that, the compiler does that, or we guarantee that behavior?
A zero length array of I32 has a line 4,
And people use that a
even
lot.
though it's a zero size type.
People use that a lot to do alignment, actually. I think we should say one ZSTs.
Repr West 1 ZSTs in repr C structures should not affect the layout.
Yeah.
That makes sense because that's the same rule as repr transparent.
Right.
Great.
Where
Thanks
does
for
the
that was a good thing to point out.
Where does the canonical definition of one ZST live?
It's sort of a convention. It means a zero size type with alignment 1. It's, but I think it's in the unsafe code guidelines repo. It's where
That's
it
what I was
arose.
wondering. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. This was probably worth drilling into, though. Okay. Anything left to say on that point, or is it okay to move on? All right.
And
7.9. I don't think there's an action item here, right? Except I guess it's like Josh convey this. Is there somewhere
Yes.
to put this comment?
Real quick before we move on, the last bullet I wrote, do people also agree with that? That just in general we don't offer
Oh.
layout guarantees for repr Rust values and repr C types?
I agree, modulo, that I think we can't do arbitrary things. I just don't know what the limits are.
Right.
In particular,
There may be specific guarantees that we offer, but like in general, you shouldn't assume a specific layout of this thing.
I think if we were going to make a statement like that, we would need a little bit further clarification for what repr Rust values means. Because, for example, if what you have is a U32 semicolon 4, there's no annotation there on either U32 or the slice type like that or array type like that makes it repr C, but nonetheless there is an expectation that that will be laid out as 4 U32s in a row.
So, interestingly, the there's there are some notes here. I don't recall what it was. I don't know. Anyway, this is obviously not official, but it makes a much stronger statement, which is also incompatible with what we said, more or less incompatible with what we said. It kind of makes two contradictory statements. No, actually, it's correct. This statement matches. It says normally it works like this for most platforms, but you have to consult your actual specification. The intention is to match the C compiler, and repr Rust can't match the C compiler, so that's a little bit tricky. It has a little bit about zero size that may or may not be quite right. You should try to, there's a sort of action item to reconcile these. Josh, where is this conversation happening? Can you just take an action item to summarize the stuff
Yes.
from Zulip and this in the issue, so it's somewhere persistent?
Sure. Also, the further conversation on Zulip is in a thread on general entitled "Data Layout / ABI Expert Needed."
Yeah, okay. All right, moving on. Someone note the action item for Josh. So unsafe option in unsafe function, and oh, nothing to say here. This is an FCP. We have to wait. There's a PR 79309. It changes the behavior of super inside modules that are inside code blocks, and it allows you to name things from the block, I guess. Other items from the block. This is useful for Rustock, but Petroshenkov doesn't like it. And there's a kind of question on what to do. I haven't looked too deeply into it.
I dug into this and also wrote a quick comment asking some questions, not least of which this needs a crater run. But general thoughts: on the one hand, this seems completely reasonable, and on the other hand, name resolution is subtle and quick to anger, and how often does this come up, and is it worth it?
That sounds right. So I guess we'll wait and see the answer to those questions.
Well, it probably couldn't hurt to get the general temperature of the rest of the language team, though, on, like, does this sound reasonable? The example up at the top comment explains why this is relevant, that we normally turn doc tests and similar into a function and wrap them in a function because you can write items inside a function, including mod declarations or anything else. And this is one case in which that is not a transparent transformation, that if you embed a module inside a function, then any items defined as siblings of that module are not accessible via super the way they would if you defined them inside a module.
I want to make the case that maybe defining things inside functions is the wrong way to go. Maybe there's a missing feature of like an anonymous module or something. I don't know.
Well, the tricky bit there is if you put it inside of a wrapping module, then you wouldn't be allowed to write inline code without a wrapping function in a doc test. So you do actually need to be in a context where you can write both items and code. And right now that means you're inside a function.
Okay.
Is this only doc tests? I mean, it's
That
also
appears
like
to be the
eval
primary
blah.
motivating example. You could obviously have this come up inside of a function elsewhere, but people don't normally do that. So I would expect that 90% of the case this practically affects is doc tests.
I agree with the other comment that this feels like the deprecate weird nesting of items thing that we've talked about before. That I don't know that a module in here ever actually makes sense other than for the doc test case.
So the deprecating of weird nesting, though, that issue is sort of molded into or changed slightly into somewhat more of like a coherence related thing, at least from my understanding, given that I think the primary motivation there is like IDE support and laziness. Does that match with what you had in mind?
Yeah, I think so.
That was the primary motivation. Corner cases, I think, were the secondary one.
I think I agree. If you're going towards this fits all of those rules of this is still coherent, I would agree with that.
It could be opt-in if we're worried about breakage. If the real motivating use case is doc tests, then who cares if they have to generate some wacky attribute, right?
I like that
I mean,
argument.
broadly, like, I don't know how much we want to value this, given that it's not particularly practical, but like I would have expected that this would worked. Like this code, like if you showed me this code and somebody was like, is this valid Rust code? I would probably have said yes. Like it doesn't surprise me that it doesn't work in the sense that like inner like nested items are weird, but I kind of like looking at it, it looks like reasonable code.
Yeah. I don't think the current behavior of super is especially intuitive. I'm not quite sure I understand why Petroshenkov was. Might be worth asking them to expand.
I did ask that in my follow-up comments, but if I were to take a wild guess, they probably could be summarized as not worth it because name resolution is painful.
Yeah, that sounds right.
But let's see what the actual follow-up says rather than ascribing that.
Right.
What
It says it brings inconsistencies to the language and fits poorly into the existing system. I'm not sure what inconsistencies they're thinking of.
I actually have a question, RE inconsistencies. What happens when you're inside a function and you use self colon to refer to things defined in the current function? Does that
I think that does not.
I think that's current module still.
I think if that doesn't work, then I think this also shouldn't work. Right? Because you'd like for the inner module super to match the current scope's self.
I agree they should both be consistent with one another. And I think that they're not. I mean, I think they are today consistent. I'm testing it now. Yeah, you get an error if you use self. Inside a function, self refers to the module that encloses the function. I don't know what happens on the PR.
And there's just no explicit
I don't
path
really
to
feel we
reference
can
something inside your same function, right?
Right. I don't feel the motivation for making a backwards incompatible change here is sufficient. Like, if it's just to make doc tests work, that we should do it some other way. Even if it just breaks some random crates, who cares? It's still kind of like arbitrary.
I definitely like is there a use of this other than doc tests that is a quote unquote good use?
Right. I would be okay with potentially doing it over an addition, for example. And doc tests work well in 2021 and not so great in 2018 or whatever. But
Can I ask? So, if we were going to merge this PR and allow super : does everyone also expect that self : in functions would allow you to refer to both items in the current module and in the current function?
yes. No.
So then you would expect that the behavior of super inside the module doesn't match, inside a module at the same level, doesn't match the behavior of self outside of the module?
What I would expect is that if I write self : t inside the function, it behaves exactly as if the function were a module, so to speak. Like the function becomes an anonymous module or something like that.
So that isn't what happens today though, right?
No, it's not what happens today. But I think self and super should be consistent in that self, whatever scope self refers to, super should refer to its parent scope. I mean, here's an example test. This does not compile. All right, let's move on because I want the next one seems more important, and we're not going to settle this 100% today, I think. Final comments? Okay. Allow qualified paths in struct construction 80080. Scott or Ryan, what's going on here?
Should I talk to this?
Yeah.
Please do.
Yeah, so this is basically allowing struct construction through qualified paths. So, for instance, if you have an associated type, being able to construct that type through referring to it through its associated type name, which is, it doesn't even parse today in many cases. So the question really is, should this just parse and return back an error message that doesn't change any language semantics? That's not really like, that should be the bare minimum. Or should it parse, and should you be able to actually perform it in both expression and pattern position?
Didn't we like settle this at some point? I'm confused.
Yeah, I was under the impression when we were looking at this originally that the thing that we approved and went to PFCP on was that we wanted to actually allow this and not just parse this. The example given, I think a good example summary is in Ali OBK's comment on December 18th that shows an example of doing this as bar as a : associated, and using that as in both patterns and expressions. And I think that that's perfectly reasonable, and we want to allow that. I thought that was the intention to begin with.
Yes, it was my understanding that that wasn't resolved, although I wasn't here for that meeting, so I'm not sure.
Oh, Ryan, you wrote in your comment there's some kind of inconsistency. Struct tuple structs are treated differently, and this needs to be changed. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, currently with both the implementation of, like, so there is what is currently in the language today, there is what is in the pull requests, and there is what should be in the language tomorrow. And from what is in the pull request right now should not be merged because there is inconsistency. And I'm refreshing my memory as I go, but basically for one type of struct type, so like a tuple struct, we don't allow this, but for structs we do. And it was my question, like, I assume we should be consistent. Whatever is possible with structs should be possible with tuple structs as well.
Can you type an example into the hack?
So I think to clarify what's happening here, if I can guess at it, when you define a tuple struct, you're declaring both a type and a function with the same name as the type. And when you create this, associated type alias, you're only aliasing the type, not the type constructor function.
Mm-hmm.
Are you suggesting that that's what the
what happens
semantics are, or what the actual, like, what the compiler, why the compiler doesn't allow this currently? Because
both.
The compiler doesn't allow it currently simply because it doesn't parse it. Like, and it should be.
Can you write the code that you expect to work? That would really help me.
Yes, I believe it's already in the pull request, so I can just hopefully copy paste it.
That's even better.
I think you can just change the example I have above to use parens instead of braces, and you can see why it wouldn't work, right?
That's I agree. That's probably what's happening. I just wanted to see it. And I think I agree with Taylor that it probably shouldn't work. Given
Yeah,
the semantics
it's like unfortunate that that's how it works, but I do think that makes sense. Like,
right. So when you say this is the only thing that currently parses, oh, okay, I understand.
Yes. So if you look down below the with tuple struct this trait : associated type A, in a pattern that's interesting.
Yeah, pattern is interesting.
Because the pattern I would expect to work, but the construction I would expect to not work, which is particularly unfortunate.
Yes.
And again, to clarify, when you say you expect it not to work, as in you do not think that the language semantics should allow for that, is what you were saying.
My expectation is that the language semantics today are not congruent with that working. Yes.
I think among other things, you can have you probably don't, but you could have a method and a type with the same name. Because they're in different namespaces.
Yes, you can, except for tuple structs because they declare a type and a function with the same
No,
name.
I'm saying in a trait specifically.
Yes.
Yeah, it's kind of unfortunate. But I don't. Do you understand what we're saying, Ryan?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Is that why the thing that's parsing today is parsing, because it's being parsed as a method call?
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I fully agree with that.
It's being parsed as a function call, not a method call. Like this is
Sure,
a qualified
okay.
path, and then it's a call expression on the path.
It's been too long since I've actually touched this code to argue against that, but my recollection is that that might be true, like that it eventually would lead to that, but currently, like, it doesn't parse because the code to handle that case simply just does not expect
No.
it to happen.
I was talking about the case that parses, to be clear. I meant the one case that currently parses. The reason that it
Okay.
parses, it seems like it's because it's a function call.
I don't know exactly what I expect from patterns. If you make some weird example where can you do this? There's some way, right, to like siphon out just the type name and not the other. I'm trying to think how you would do that right now. I guess it's kind of hard to do. I was wondering what happens if you do that and then use it in a pattern. But
I mean, this sort of dual itemness of tuple structs is annoying in a bunch of other places in the language, right? We've hit this before with I think it was blanket imports for types or something like that.
Yeah, it's super annoying.
I remember that, yeah.
In retrospect, I wish we had one namespace and oh well.
Yes, please.
A little late now.
Instead of 3.
Or however many we even have, I don't know. Yes.
I guess 4 if you count lifetimes, but I don't know, they're kind of in the type namespace, right?
I'm thinking about macros. I guess they live with modules.
Yeah, I was saying macros, methods, or macros, items, and types, right? Are the 3 I had in my head.
Yeah, anyway. Well, so I guess Taylor and I are arguing. Does anyone want to argue the opposite? That this is expected behavior, weird as it is, that I should say what this is, that we expect it to work with, we expect you to be able to use brace syntax with structs this way. And I think that can be done with tuple structs too, right? If you name the field 0, 1, 2, 3 or something.
I haven't tried that personally, but
I bet it would work.
I would expect so.
But we don't
I have
expect
to drop
parentheses
off,
to
but this is
work.
very unfortunately weird.
Yeah.
So I imagine we'll talk about this later.
Yeah, we can probably leave it here and come back to it, I guess.
What I can do is just finish the PR to get like as far as possible with accepting as much as I can, and then we can use that to discuss.
All right, that sounds useful. I feel like I can't make a good case again. Like, not supporting this at all seems probably worse than the fact that it's going to be not great. or like going to be inconsistent. But
So should I resolve my concern as this PFCP is for making it work in all the cases?
Well, in which case we should raise a new concern for we need to consistently handle tuples, right?
well, I don't know. All right, let's let Ryan experiment, and we'll come back. I don't think this is what I expect. Works no matter what sort of struct type is, but the fields may be named 0. Also, people can drop off at the end of the call. Thank you all for coming. This is in expression position. I don't know what I expect in patterns. This kind of reminds me vaguely of this, which in Rust is invoke method bar and not call the function foo.bar. Just like in Rust, Java. Anyway, no, we didn't get to this last one, but oh well, we'll do that next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
One random thing since you're on the call, Josh.
Sure.
I've put here's how the try stuff could be edition sensitive in the libzulib chat. I think it
Awesome.
might actually be pretty reasonable. It's a surprisingly small change.
Effectively, how we could allow the interoperability with option and result with none error, but only in previous editions and not in the current edition.
From residual, we can make a new version of it with a blanket impl from the common one. So it's looking like I've put a link to the commit there if you want to see. It's looking like it would basically be able to be communicated as there's 2 extra impls in old editions, which I think is understandable enough to not get people annoyed at the difference.
And if you do a blanket import of mod sadness, then you get those extra impls.
No, it would just be there's a new trait in there that has those impls on it. So 2015 and 2018 would use that version of the tri-residual trait, and
I see. So this would be a change the desugar?
Yeah, to just use a different trait in different editions.
Okay, I think I get it now. So from residual legacy would be the desugaring in previous editions, and that has a blanket impl for anything that is from residual non-legacy, and then it also has the sad impls that we wish we didn't have.
Yeah.
Okay, I buy that. That will need some careful documentation to cover that case of like, here's where you'll see this weird name. And I am tempted to call it, rather than like from residual legacy, I'd be tempted to call it like from residual 2015, 2018.
Yeah.
That way it's more self-documenting, but that aside, I mean, in much the same way as I find your whole please call the OK or method type there very amusing.
Yeah, that name is probably a little too long because Rust format insisted on wrapping my function definitions. Yeah. Anyway, I don't have anything concrete there. I wanted to just
Sure.
Found that yesterday. I guess I need to figure out logistically if I want to propose that. Do I go back to libs and have a conversation, or do we do that on nightly as a conversation?
I think we should probably, if we're going to do that break across an edition for the desugaring, we also need to re-raise it for Lang as well. I think that the answer for do we mind desugaring that differently by edition will probably be yes, but we should raise it.
Okay.
Also, let me. I had an idea that would both shorten. Well, shortening aside, it would make it clearer.
Okay. Yeah.
If you were going to be, giving a weird name to something anyway, then by all means use non-standard style so that it's extremely self-documenting.
Yeah.
It'd
I
be
think
really amusing if we had a sufficiently raw mechanism for identifiers that you could actually stuff a space into that identifier or a dot. Please call dot OK or open paren close paren.
I think if we do the break, this becomes less of a depending on that type name to get it.
Fair.
Because part of the magic of that one was that if you tried to do it with only the one implementation, that name would show up in the error message. But if we use a version where 2021 and up doesn't even have that impl, the type name would never show up. So we might be able to go back to just something else, or put a note in Rust on implemented or something to avoid it.
Makes sense. I do need to drop off for another meeting, but this was a great follow-up.
Excellent. Thanks for taking a look.